It's interesting how in non-Indigenous society there are so many boundaries around experience, and so many experiences siloed from one another. You see, for Indigenous Australians and for my ancestors, my grandmother and her grandmother, Yorta Yorta women from the Barmah forest, just to contextualise, for my ancestors and for me as an artist, there is no separation between the arts and as pleasure and as functional. And it's interesting how we do silo our experiences. You see, for Indigenous Australians, all of our knowledge has been passed on through the visual and the performing arts for those 60 or 70,000 years. So the knowledge of science and geography and the stars and everything else sung. You know, a song, I've said it many times, a song is not just a song. A song is a map. And yet, at the same time, the experience of singing is one that is so, it can be so healing, it can be so enriching and enjoyable and pleasurable, and yet at the same time, it is that way of finding your own journey from place to place. Mm-hmm. There's no separation there, and I think that this is where constantly Indigenous artists come up against these barriers that have been put in the way to compartmentalise experience. And I think experimental music, I can't think of any music that isn't experimental, even if you're playing a well-worn cover. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as a statement, I suppose. But even if you're playing a well-worn cover that belongs to somebody else and their expectations of how it'll go and what it'll sound like and the chord progression and so on and so forth, it is an experiment, it is an act of faith in creating that at the moment that you're creating it. It is experimental in some way. And so as we delve further into the unknown and the unexpected, I guess, is that what you mean by experimental? Something that's not so familiar, but...
Yeah, I suppose what I mean by the experimental is something that cuts through certain assumptions or orthodoxies that have enclosed a mode of expression. You know, so when something becomes very established, how do we kind of break that apart and not necessarily move forward, but maybe expose some of the assumptions that produce that music or that art form or even that thought. And it's interesting that experiments often, there's often in art forms a kind of continuity where each advancement pushes an art form a little bit further along a path, but there are other moments of profound contradiction where the next big step is to completely disagree with what came before rather than to advance it just a little bit. So I'd love to get your perspective on that coming from opera, which is such a traditional art form, and also in the Australian context a very colonial one, a European art form that has been imported here. As an Indigenous artist performing opera, it's quite a interesting situation to be in, whether there can be a kind of decolonising opera practice, and if that's how you see it.
Well, thanks for that question, because I feel safe on that ground. It's interesting, opera. Look, at its most basic, it's a sung story. And Indigenous Australians have been singing their story for 70,000 years. I think one of the points you were making before in the question you would have put to Uncle Jack was about the personal narrative, certainly, and histories. But quite seriously, the sung story in opera is something that Indigenous people are really familiar with. And the tradition or the traditions of opera, because they're quite separate from each other, the French school, the German school, the Italian, Czech, Russian, Chinese opera, the many styles of opera that have existed in Western society and in non-Western societies, all have this one thing in common, that music allows for a story to transcend the ordinary and I believe for a truth that is contained in music to transcend the analytical and enter straight in to the soul. Opera's always been a logical form of expression for me. My excuse me, my Aboriginal family were all singers. My uncle, Jimmy, was probably the most, well, he was the most well-known, but Jimmy would often say that my mother, Monica, his sister, had the most beautiful voice in the family, but she'd inherited that from her mother and from her mother and so on and so on. And what were we doing? We were singing our story, and we may have used someone else's lyrics, and it may have come in the form of a country and Western song. And there's the point, the relationship between the country and Western song and opera. I mean, where is the connection there? Well, it's the sung story and the personal narrative that is so important to both forms. And I just knew that I couldn't possibly be the only Aboriginal woman who wanted to sing opera in the whole of Australia. I was determined that I wouldn't be the only, and of course created Short Black Opera in order to enable a pathway or create a pathway for other Indigenous singers. But I feel that, it's interesting, the other day I had the opportunity to go to a review on the state of opera in Australia, and several of the major companies are under review at the moment, and a great room was assembled. There may be people here today that were at that session where basically the review panel were there to hear what we think the state of play is and how and if opera should be funded in this country. How will it continue? And it was interesting on two levels. One, for the lack of commentary. I know we're very polite here in Melbourne, but it was there were very few voices that were actually heard in that room. People were there, but they didn't feel that they wanted to or could speak up. But when people did speak up, there was this constant reference to the repertoire that we hear and the repertoire that we don't hear. And the other point that was made was, what about the new repertoire? But my point was, what about the Australian voice in all of this? See, opera that we think of is a particular style of singing, but really its potency is in the way that it can tell a story, an intimate story or the really, really big stories. So I didn't see any disconnect, actually. And I think I used to joke about it, but I'm a little bit more serious. I think that if in fact Indigenous Australian culture is the longest living culture in the world, then we probably invented opera as a form before it was called that. And I think that that's something that Australians can take pride in. I mean, for myself, in dreams as aspirations, which is something different from dream time, which is something different from dreaming as a creative process, but a dream that I would have is that as Australians we would come to the point of maturity where we would take pride in the Indigenous culture that has more runs on the board than anybody else. And in particular in the realm of the visual and the and the performing arts. We haven't reached that point. We're quite away from it at the moment, but I think what we do as artists, and as all the speakers here today, from the philanthropic efforts of Betty Amsden and through to Emma's work in neuroscience, we are able to help that process of maturity speed up a little bit. We have to be courageous, and it takes great courage to dream.
If you're going to say that Indigenous culture invented opera, then I'd like to say it invented experimental music too.
Thank you. I'll take that as well. We could say that, though, and actually nobody else in the world gets to say that. And that's not to say we get to say it and you just have to applaud. It's we get to say that. We're here now together. And on this land, it's not only I that can draw the energy from the experience of those 1,000 generations or more, it's all of us. You know, when we were listening to Andrew earlier on, and you know, I wanted to get into this idea of the lens. You know, what's the function of the lens in your process of dreaming and creating? That lens, and what I've been trying to promote in the last couple of years is this idea that we might look through an Indigenous lens in this landscape, and that there's absolutely nothing to be lost and everything to be gained by doing that. And it seems to me that we have a situation where so many people still in Australia are looking through the wrong end of that lens. And so these achievements of Indigenous Australians and our identity and our expression of that identity seems so remote and distant and just too hard, straight into the too hard basket. Dreaming, though, in the sense of the Indigenous dreaming and dream time, you know, I take us back to the question that I asked earlier on. You know, what's the level of respect generally in Australia for the process of dreaming? Is it seen as a waste of? Is it seen as a waste of time? Is it? Have you encountered discouragement? You know, if you have, now I'm interviewing you. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll talk.
Yeah, look, I think probably the generation that I'm, you know, roughly part of the sort of post-internet kind of generation, I think we're so overloaded with concrete information that it can be quite hard to dream outside of those terms. It can be quite hard to imagine something that doesn't already exist in some way, or imagine things being a way other than how they are. We probably spend most of our energy resolving the pragmatic problems and issues that we encounter day to day. And when we look for sort of leadership, you know, politically or in other places, we kind of don't really see grand, you know, sort of utopian visions being offered, but, you know, micro shifts a little bit this way or a little bit that way, or revisions of what we already have. So
what if everything already exists? Everything already exists. It's simply a matter of whether you can see it or not.
Yeah, I think so. And some of the most valuable strategies are the ones that expose what is already there, hiding in plain view, just below the surface, rather than having a sort of a utopian kind of fantasy about how to proceed towards perfect harmony. Often we have sort of beautiful and elegant ideas that are floating around the periphery, but are just not visible, or as a sound person, I could say audible. You know, some of the most interesting voices are drowned out by the loudest ones.
Yeah. I think that today we have been so fortunate to create a space and a time in which dreaming is acceptable, dreaming is encouraged, dreaming is valued, and perhaps even a little more understood than it was a couple of hours ago. I think that I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers today, and perhaps Natalie, you were about to do that. I could see you just out of the corner of my eye. But Joel, I think it's been a real pleasure to actually come up against some of those ideas with you, and maybe even push those boundaries a little bit further out. And maybe I feel like I know less than I did before because I want to inquire more. But I do like this notion that everything actually already exists, and it's whether we can see it. And I think the story that Tony told earlier on of the waterfall that is out there at the edge of the bay, and that the Bunwarang and the Woiwurrung knew about that, and that science was catching up to it. So what if everything exists and we just have to be able to dream for long enough to be able to see it?
I hope that's true.
I think it is.